Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Wyoming PBS, in collaboration with the Wyoming Veterans Commission, filmed interviews with Wyoming Vietnam-era veterans at the Wyoming Vietnam Veterans Welcome Home Reunion held in Casper, June 4th through 7th. In the interviews, veterans described their experiences about their service during the Vietnam War and what it was like when they came home. A note to our viewers, some of the content is explicit. These are veterans' experiences told through their own words, and we are grateful for their sacrifice and for their service and their willingness to share. You can see all of our interviews, uncut, at wyomingpbs.org/Vietnam.
I remember the country, you know, if you've ever been in the hills behind Salt Lake City, how they just kind of jut up, or in our great Wyoming country, the Tetons, how they gain elevation in a hurry. The mountains in Vietnam were like that, heavily vegetated in certain areas. Really tough going up and down those. You know, I mean, you're packing around something on your back, and that, you know, is full of food and what water you could take with you, and it was a young man's sport. It's just not something that you would, this day and age, that I wouldn't even think about doing. I don't care how tough you think you might be or anything like that. It's just unusual that but climbing up and down those mountains is tough. That was real work, you know. And being a corpsman, you not only had your backpack, and all your food products, you had your medical that you carried along with that, and that was another 20-30 pounds of stuff that you carried over and above that. And if you were a good corpsman, and if you were with a unit that really believed in you, you carried some of their ammunition with you too. So you sometimes have a couple of cans of machine gun ammo that you packed with you. Those, you know, you just did what you could do. A good funny story with the steep mountains. When you went to sleep at night, you made sure you had a tree between your legs. Reason for the tree between your legs, so you didn't slide all the way down the hill. And you could. I mean, you'd roll, you'd fall asleep. I mean, you could fall asleep and didn't sleep a lot, but you still did. But it was pretty cool to watch guys that they'd wake up in the morning and they'd be 20, 30, 40 feet down the hill from you. You didn't find a tree, did you?
My very first patrol I went on, the 11th Cav had a patrol that was overdue, and so we went out to look for them. 6 hours out, we found a patrol, and everyone had been killed. They had stripped everything down. They were just in their shorts and t-shirts, boots, all their equipment were gone. And that was my first experience with combat fatalities. So from that point on, the reality of war set in. So, and anyway, I came back home in April of '69 to Northern California. Was not a good experience. We landed in Oakland Air Base. And as we were getting off the plane, they thought it would be really funny to blow the sirens. And you know, of course, we all hit the tarmac, you know, just laid out, and everybody's laughing. They thought it was funny. But when a siren went off in Vietnam at a fire base, that meant incoming round. And so I was, you know, hit the dirt or get to a bunker. But anyway, so we were really wanting to start processing and get out, you know, and they said, no, you can't start processing until you guys go to the mess hall and have a steak dinner. Go to the mess hall, have a steak dinner. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. So anyway, we would go to the mess hall. We emptied all the milk machines that they had there, because you don't get cold milk in Vietnam. So we had cold milk and steaks, and then we got back out in the bleachers, and they started processes out. But when we finally got our final orders to go where we were going, either to another duty station or go home on leave or whatever. I was going home on leave, and I had to go to San Francisco Airport, and that was, Harry Kushner's bald-headed, gold-robed idiots were roaming the airport, and of course people would throw trash at you and spit on you, call you baby killer, warmongers, and that kind of stuff. And then when I got out, like I said, I went through about 18 jobs in 6 months because of the same thing. I lost the first 3 jobs. They said, are you a Vietnam vet? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, we don't have any jobs here for you. My 4th job, I ended up hitting the supervisor because he called me a baby killer, and I decked him and put him on the ground. Of course, that meant I didn't have a job, but I just couldn't adapt. Everything just caused me being a real anger issue all the time, and so I told my wife, I said, I've got to go back into the military, because that's the only place I really felt secure, and they understood us, So I went back and I went into the Air Force.
Well, being from small town over in Mountain View, I think I had a conversation earlier today. We were talking about, we had friends when we were still in high school who were drafted, did a tour, got discharged, and were home by the time we graduated. So, we actually had friends telling us genuine live war stories. And the few of us that, I think we had already made up our mind that we were going to go into the military. And I don't remember that any of them really told us anything terrible, And I think maybe part of that was the small town. We saw it as an honorable thing that, they had gone, they had done their duty, and had come home. In Uintah County, there were only 6 actual deaths, and those were spread out over the entire war. And the last one, I think, was in the late 60s. So as kids, we hadn't heard any of that. We watched it on TV, but we were seeing our peers go away, do their thing, and come back. And so I don't think that we saw it, certainly not as a deterrent. And I don't really think that it changed anybody's feelings about whether we should or shouldn't, or, I'm not going to do that.
Did basic training and advanced infantry training, and went to Germany. I spent 21 months in Germany, and I was a young guy. We traveled all over Europe. Life couldn't be any better. And then several of us got orders to go to Hawaii, and we thought, oh man, the Army is so good to us. And so now we get to go to Hawaii. We've been in Europe, now we get to go to Hawaii. Well, what they didn't tell us that it was for 3 months of jungle warfare training for further reassignment to Southeast Asia. So we went over to Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, did the jungle training, got on the ship out of Pearl Harbor on December the 6th, 1967, and spent 16 days as Navy people going across the ocean, and landed in Vietnam. And I was in northern Vietnam in a place called Quang Ngai Province, and I was an infantry guy, infantry and mortars, and So that started my tour in Vietnam. I have to tell you that most of the stuff that happened I don't have any memory of because of an injury, but I can tell you most of the stuff I did because of research that I've done. And so we did all the typical stuff that infantry guys in 1967 and 68 did in Vietnam. I went through the Tet Offensive in 1968 in northern Vietnam. I lived through that. One of the incidents that happened in 1968, in March of 1968, April 1968, is I went into a tunnel complex that was a Viet Cong battalion tunnel complex, and we had found the air vents to that tunnel, and we poured napalm, liquid napalm, down the air vents and ignited it, and it blew the doors out of the tunnels. And I went down in there, and I got severely burned from the residual napalm stuff that was in there. So my face and my mouth and my arms and my hand and all that were burned, but I ended up pulling 21 Viet Cong soldiers out of there that had been in the tunnel that died from the explosion, and a half a dozen live ones, and there was like 4 of us that went in there. And I have very little memory of that, except to remember pulling body after body after body out. And I remember thinking when I was doing that, you know, these guys are soldiers too. You know, I remember that. You know, they were just fighting for a different army than we were. And so that was the first part of April 1968. And then the May 1st, 1968, I was, and I don't have much memory of this, but I've got the documentation now. I was with battalion commander, Colonel Franklin, of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Infantry Regiment of the 11th Light Infantry Brigade. And we were searching a hut, a little hooch, we call them a hooch. And I bumped a booby trap, and there was a bomb that was in a bin of rice, a big basket of rice. And so there was a huge explosion, and I ended up nearly dying. And Colonel Franklin took me to the hospital in his own helicopter because it didn't think he had time for a dust-off. And so I was in a field hospital at Chu Lai, and then apparently they sent me to a hospital that's called the 91st Evacuation Hospital, which is in a town called Tui Wa. And so I was in this hospital, and in this bomb blast, my eyes, both of my eyes had gotten severely burned, and I got shrapnel in my right eye. And I had lots of other injuries too. But one of those injuries was my eyes were burned. And so I'm in this hospital in Tui Wa with my eyes burned, and they're bandaged, and I can't see anything, and I'm blind. And so in a few days, and I can't tell you how long, but in a few days, this doctor came in, and he said something to the effect that they were going to take the bandages off, and they didn't know if I'd be blind or be able to see. And so he said, we just want to make you aware of that. We want to prepare you for this. And so some nurse started taking the bandages off of my eyes, and just in the course of conversation, this nurse says, where are you from, soldier? Or something similar to that. And I said, I'm from Cody, Wyoming. And this nurse said, oh really? I'm from Casper, Wyoming. And that's all I remember about that part of being in the hospital. But I've always, all these years, I've remembered that statement from this nurse. I can't tell you what she looked like. I can't tell you how much longer she took care of me. But she was from Casper, Wyoming. And I don't know if she went into the military from Casper or was raised in Casper, but I'm right here at this reunion in Casper, Wyoming today, 50 years or 40-some years later. And that nurse, 40-some years ago, in 1968, took care of me in the 91st. So I went to the reunion, and the guy running it said, there's another guy here that was in your company that came over on the boat too, and he's here. And so he got us hooked up, and the guy said who he was. I didn't know him. And so he started talking to me. He's an old guy, 75 years old, can't hear, worse hearing than me, and I can't hear. And so he was saying that he couldn't remember much, but he worked for Colonel Franklin. And I said, well, I worked for Colonel Franklin, which I wouldn't have known until a few months before when I went to the first reunion. And so he said, but I do remember a couple of incidents that happened in Vietnam with Colonel Franklin. And so he started telling me about this incident about one of the guys in his company. They poured this napalm down these air vents, and they torched it off, and his tunnel rat went down in the tunnel and pulled all these dead bodies out. And I says, oh, really? I says, I was in an incident just exactly like that. And I said, Colonel Franklin must have had 2 of those incidents. And he described it to a T, what I had heard when I was at the other reunion. And then he said, yeah, and then he said, I was at a fire base called Dragon. And I said, well, I was on a fire base called Dragon. And he said, yeah. He said, one of my guys that was an infantry guy, but he did mortars too. And he said, on Highway 1, we had this sniper that kept shooting at the convoys all the time. And he said this guy came up with this idea about putting this mortar in the back of a dump truck with sandbags, and he had sighted it all in and everything first. And we'd go down the road, and when the guy was shooting at us, we'd shoot this mortar after him and get him. And I said, and he told me exactly what happened. I says, that was me that did that. I said, what did you say your name was? And he said, Bob Dixon. I said, are you Captain Dixon? I said, you were my company commander. And we talked to each other for 20 minutes without it realizing who each other was. And he was not going to go to that reunion, but his wife talked him into it. And I was not going to go to that reunion, but I got talked into it. So my old company commander and I met at a reunion that wasn't even our reunion. And we met. And then I told him about the other reunion, the first one that I went to. And then the next year he came to that. And so we're all back together again after all these years.
Well, probably one of the most eventful, I suppose, and memorable is actually the Tet Offensive. The company had gotten probably a little complacent, hadn't seen a lot of action. And people were a little careless, in my opinion, weren't paying a lot of attention as they should have. And the morning of the Tet Offensive, I was on outpost and happened to make contact with some people that I didn't like. And it really opened my eyes up and the rest of the world's that we're in a real war. I mean, there was just people dead, and I was part of that, helping do that. And it really woke everybody up, and my instinct is, or my old country boy, I don't know if it's instinct or not, it's probably what saved me through that first hours of Tet is we were on outpost writing letters, me and another kid, but I always kept my M16 right here. It wasn't over there parked on a tree or laying over there. I always kept it right here. And that probably was the only reason I'm here today. And then people kind of learned to do that later on, that, hey, this is a bad deal.
When I got back to the University of Iowa, that's where I was assigned, because I was from Iowa originally. That's where I was born and raised, and that's where I entered the service. When I got back to the University of Iowa, the first time I stepped on campus in uniform, I got snowballed. If you're going on a liberal arts campus, that's and there was rioting on the University of Iowa campus for several years. I hardly carried a weapon in Vietnam, but I was walking guard on the ROTC Armory with a loaded .45 on the University of Iowa campus.
We had 2 riots at the University of Wyoming. The first one was when Coach Lloyd Eaton fired. We called it, I think it was the Black 13. At that time, BYU would not let black players into the university. And our players at the university decided that they were going to wear a black armband, and he says, no, you're not, or I'll fire you. So he ended up firing them, which started a riot. They called us up, they called all the highway patrol in. They had bus loads of blacks coming in out of Denver. We got a couple of them stopped, but we still had some riots at the university. The second one was when the Kent State happened. The whole country erupted at that time into riots on all. So in all, we had 2 riots over there. And the thing that was strange in Laramie, Wyoming, was we had people in our unit, and on the other side of the line was their fathers. They were professors, they had their brothers, so we always kind of talked like it was almost like a civil war. We had to stand off against our own, some of those guys, our own fathers and our own brothers in there. So it made for really an uneasy thing. And then the whole country's attitude towards a soldier changed. And at first we were so proud to wear our uniform, and then we could not wear them at all. You know, if we went on post,
you had an order.
To be there, you were called baby killers. You were, you know, how many people are you going to kill over there? Why are you doing? They didn't. I don't know why they didn't blame the government. They blamed us, the soldier, because we were the face. We were the ones that they could do something about it. So I felt like when I left there, it was turmoil. I didn't tell anybody that I had ever even been in the military for 20 years.
I was 45 years hiding the fact that I was nuts. You know, I didn't know what PTSD was. I didn't realize I had it. I didn't. And finally, one of my nephews was a Gulf War veteran. He come back and he said, "Uncle Steve, you got PTSD." I told him, "Ah, come on." So I went in and I started getting treatment, and I would suggest anybody even suspects anything like that, go get counseling and some treatment, because it's opened my life up for me. I mean, my eyes are open. It's not like I'm not. Well, I was kind of ashamed. I was ashamed, and I don't know. I just didn't like myself very well, you know, because I just, you know, the reaction. I could hold a job, but I could never get promoted in a job because I'd always picking fights or something like that for years, and I'm over that now. I'm not doing that now.
When I came back from Vietnam, I was healthy as you and I. I mean, doing nothing wrong. And about I'd say about 15 years after I got out, retired, I started having problems. I ended up with 2 strokes, 2 heart attacks, colon cancer. I had my 2nd pacemaker, and it all due from Agent Orange. I can't walk from my feet. This knee here is bone on bone. I got neuropathy from the knees down. I try to stand, and I can't stand. Especially if I try to put this down first. And this knee here, I'll go flip right out over. But what got me with the Agent Orange fact was the thing is that they kept telling us, "Oh, that's nothing. It's a foliage killer. You ain't got to worry about it." Yeah, that was right. But boy, I'll tell you, the way they poured it on us, I'd be in my uniform and I'd be soaking wet with that. I'd head for the showers. I turned on the shower, just stand under it for about a half an hour to just rinse off. I'd get my clothes all rinsed off. I'd take them and I threw them away. I had to buy more if I had to, but they gave them to me. But I'd clean off double soap in order to get that stuff off. It didn't burn. You couldn't feel any difference. It was just like water pouring on you. But it's the after effects what happened, because all that hit me all through, after all the years. It took time to go through me, but it's left me with like my heart doctor telling me, he says, "You are a challenge."
My experiences in Vietnam, if you look at all the bad and the good, I have found out a way to make those experiences more positive than negative. Simple things like electric lights, running water, the things that everybody takes for granted. When you get over there and you live in a third world country, and the only way you get water is to bail it hand over hand out of a well, and then you have to pay somebody for that water. That gives you an appreciation of turning on a faucet over here where the water just comes out. And if you want electric lights, you have to have a generator, and it better run, and it better be maintained, and you better have fuel for it, or when nighttime comes, you won't have any lights. So those are just 2 examples of the things that the average everyday American takes for granted. But if you live without that for a while, then you appreciate what I call the finer things in life.
I guess I never really knew what it meant to have a homecoming. I see them on TV all the time. And what's the big deal? Well, I found out what the big deal is today. I saw people clapping and saying, "We love you," and "We love all of you." I remember one gentleman saying, "I love every one of you." And a man that's on the radio in the mornings, he was out there and clapping and giving us, just wonderful just way to go, and it was absolutely just the most marvelous thing. It just made me feel a lot younger, I guess. And I walked. There was several of us that walked it, which was, I think, the best way to do it, because you got to go shake hands with people, and everybody smiling, little kids coming up and shaking hands and saying thank you so much. And that was just as bad as the 19th of October 67 was. That this was just the total opposite.
You served your country in a war you did not start. You're owed much, and yet you continue to give, continue to lead, continue to build a better country. So for all of you, I just say, on behalf of the state of Wyoming, God bless you for your service. For the 120 that are not with us and to their families, we hope as you look down on today, as you look down on this state and this country, that you believe that we are doing better, and that you recognize it is because of the Vietnam vets that we are doing better. It's a great privilege to be here. To all our veterans, and I would say, I know we have at least one World War II vet, we have Korean vets, but in particular to Vietnam vets. Thank you for your service, and welcome home.